I will read to you an essay I originally wrote in 2022 about the gamification of communication. And unfortunately, it seems that most of the dangers I was referring to have indeed come true. It originally appeared on the Finnish Pirate Party website or blog in Finnish, and the translation is by Google. TLDR, social media platforms have enormous power as their actions practically determine the ways we engage in social discourse today. The problem is, on the one hand, that it's difficult for us platform users to understand this exercise of power because it's different from the traditional social power game that we are more familiar with. On the other hand, the problem is that the sole purpose of social media platforms is to maximize screen time spent on the platform's advertising revenue. Despite warnings from their own employees, the companies turned a blind eye to practically all the negative consequences of their actions for a long time. The decade of confusion that followed has been a fertile environment for the rise of conspiracy theories, racism, misogyny, and whatnot. The principles of social media in the future must be public so that the threat to the reliability of the democratic process can be minimized. Despite the presence of technology in almost every aspect of our lives, it is still difficult for people today to grasp that the computer itself has quietly become an active player in the political arena for almost all modern states. Even though we might see Donald Trump as a bumbling bluffer, our instincts direct us to see him as master strategist rather than looking up at the system that used him to get more screen time out of millions of people, not the other way around. Similarly, we like to think in terms of the rules of the past when we consider the reasons for the explosive growth of populist argumentation. Our human instincts try to forcefully look for the brilliant frontmen who are behind all this, but we are often blind to the fact that the outrageous posts of these figures often appear on our screens through familiar acquaintances. The gamification that has come with the combination of machine intelligence and social media postings in the environment is more opaque than the construct of human faces, names, and words. And it's harder to pay attention to it as the messages, it seems, are impartially conveyed from other people. It is especially difficult for us to understand where the computer is better than us. On the surface, social media algorithms can seem clumsy. They make strange mistakes, recommend completely wrong websites, endlessly push ads for things we don't want or stuff we bought, and so on. We would never give such careless and outrageous human operator the status and respect. But it has become a member of our society, part of the structure through which we communicate. And it is intelligent, but in a way that is strange and alien to us. The differences in information processing between humans and learning machines are greater than we think. Human short-term memory is vastly more comprehensive than machine learning systems, and especially so-called relevance realization, i.e. the ability to extract the most essential facts very quickly and just in the right broad strokes, is superior. Human long-term memory, on the other hand, is not exactly capable of tapping into the mountains of rational information that machine learning algorithms are trained on. We think about our lives in the terms of next few weeks and months, taking long-term changes into account only in broad strokes. Since a machine does not need to survive a sudden attack by a wasp, algorithms specialize in sifting through decades of detailed information from massive human networks as the source of their every decision. The most important thing to note that unlike us, they are not created solely on the events of an individual, but on the basis of instinctive adherence to unwritten rules of an entire cultures on top of data that is already there. Neural networks trained in this way are able to create understanding effectively even where our own processing relies mainly on our instincts, and ultimately quite unreliable long-term memory that records the past only in bits and pieces. Social media recommendation systems are based on deep machine learning models on all platforms. They were not really designed to exploit the weak links in human cognitive psychology, but because deep models optimize themselves without human interaction. But, and perhaps precisely because the models learn anything, it should come as no surprise that our innate weakness for emotional speech, especially emotional moral disapproval, supposed unfairness, straw men, and other logical fallacies, and the illusory truth effect achieved through endless repetition, they were practically discovered immediately by the algorithm. It took companies a while to react to this, many holding on to their own line based on freedom of speech and more messages between people is better for a long time while the evidence was still not clear. But before long, almost all of them have had to put out more or less some fires on the issue. However, it is hard to see how companies will ever react successfully in doing so, at least as long as the systems score the things we feed into them primarily based on how well and deeply they press trigger points that appear in our basic psychologies, which is, well, only slightly more advanced than of apes and other herd animals. Getting featured in the recommendation system, whose post you will see next, is essentially a question of successfully solving this equation and that exploits the instinctive reactions of its participants. But despite all this, we have reluctantly accepted it as the framework in which we want to have our social conversation, because in this way, the entertainment value of our social conversation increases. C. Thin applied epistemology anthology article How Twitter Gamifies Communication, or Max Fisher's recently published book Chaos Machine, the inside story of how social media rewired our minds and our world, and the publications of René Di Resta and many other early arising journalists have paved the way for finding out a framework, and I might say Di Resta started this in 2014, that social media platforms are not neutral communication media for our public discourse. It is not a question of tweaking algorithms, but rather the only starting point for analysis can be that the system's design principle itself, maximizing screen time. Our screen time is maximized by gamifying communication. It started with the like button, but it only became turbocharged when Facebook and Twitter switched to the so-called newsfeed model in 2015. In doing so, they created a scoring system for all the content we publish. There are secret rules for getting into the feed, and the one who guesses them best has the clear prize. publicity. And given our rights, Twitter is now one of our primary venues of public discourse. But it is not a neutral or transparent medium. Twitter shapes how we interact, who we interact with, and, perhaps most importantly, it suggests specific goals for those interactions. Scoring is only partially public. Retweets, likes, and shares are visible, but they are just the tip of the iceberg of a massive recommendation system looming beneath the surface. A system that takes every feed it receives and tries to maximize it to entice every user to scroll one more time, press like one more time, write one more comment. It doesn't care directly about quality. Quantity is king. But gamification was supposed to be a good thing, right? In the 2010s, the corporate world was full of hype about how gamification would make everything better and everyday life more enjoyable. Yay! Gamification brought us Fitbit and Duolingo, and those are great things, aren't they? Jane McGonigal's book, Reality is Broken, How Games Make Us Better and How They Can Change the World, focuses optimistically on how games can improve our lives. But her analysis misses a very important point. The argument that focuses on its positive effects is only valid as long as we assume that gamification does not change the value of the thing being done. The appeal of games is often based on their value systems that differ from the everyday world. Decisions in everyday life are mainly difficult and multidimensional, whereas decisions in games are simple and straightforward. Often, one can only act right or wrong. Scoring and immediate feedback on success are essential parts of the nature of a good and entertaining game. However, the most important questions in real life are those for which scoring is not suitable. Should we work overtime or spend time with the family? Should we get a dog? Should we study now or take a gap year? Scoring rather interferes with the reflection on such questions. In any case, the solution is hardly obvious, and the desire for the ultimate winner among the answers, which is part of the game's requirement, ends up weakening the ability to respond to changing pressures in the environment instead of flexibility. Difficult and complex questions do not survive in the gamified world, which is popular for wrong and right arguments. Gamification conditions us against content that unfolds slowly. Virtual currencies and prize chests are also familiar from online games. The famous psychologist and behavioral scientist B.F. Skinner discovered an interesting loophole in human psychology back in the last millennium. By changing the reward for tasks to a random size and random frequency in just the right way, a person could be made to repeat a given task more vigorously and for longer than by always offering a reward. This strategy is called intermittent variable reinforcement. This kind of randomized rewarding is known in almost every successful online video game as gacha or loot box. In the case of social media, the system randomizes the distribution of our messages to different audiences and thus tries to ensure that we do not always get the same good feedback from the same good audience, but rather that we would try again and again. After all, writing the perfect message and finding success might make us satisfied with the outcome of this session and stop it instead of continuing. The combination of maximizing screen time and gamification makes it difficult for us to assess the true quality of our messages. By transforming our public debate into entertainment by gamifying it, we have, however, increased our community's participation in it and also thus made progress in some of our democratic aspirations. An optimist would say in this situation that the heuristics offered by social media platforms about what's currently important to the community are quite sufficient, and the truncation of our value system will not necessarily be realized as long as people develop into better users. And I do agree with the concept from the premise that social media as is today must necessarily be only an interim stage. Free social media based on the sale of advertisements and thereby maximizing screen time has indeed turned all users into the world as publishers. But the price that has been paid for it is that every user is forced to play a global battle of the publishers, computer games, with rules that the community itself has not been able to define. And I'm not entirely confident that leaving the rules for our political and social debate to private, profit-seeking companies alone will ultimately lead to the desired outcome, a more open and functioning democratic society. Of course, markets are always the most efficient way to optimize production of any good, but the goods that are currently being produced is simply selling ads to people's ever-increasing screen time. The most frightening example of what this can do, for example, is the sudden rise in anti-vaccination sentiment over the past decade. The systems quite sensibly realized that while reading information based on scientific research kept users online for a few hours, attracting people to radical groups could get users to commit an entire lifestyle centered on the constant presence on a social media platform. René de Resta called this phenomenon a radicalization by recommendation engine. Anti-vaccine groups won the social media game because their emotionally charged content was ultimately optimized to appear more on YouTube than the truth. Or Facebook, actually. In a similar way, many other movements that had previously been confined to the margins of society, such as Oregonians who fear fluoride in their drinking water, gained a foothold. And the American far right also saw miracles in the so-called Gamergates, when the social media platform Reddit used it to highlight racist and misogynist attitude among young people who heavily used the internet. Steve Bannon's far-right publication Breitbart didn't have to do much to increase its circulation. Overtly racist memes, dressed in ironic humor of the internet generation, fueled the spread of Breitbart's moral disapproval and conspiracy theory-based content like wildfire on the Facebook feeds of Republican support without them having to lift a finger about it. With anti-vaccination, Gamergate, QAnon, and other conspiracy theories, machine intelligence was able to mine yet another weakness in the human psyche: hero stories. People who went on an adventure, just like in a video game, painted the story of a justice warriors fighting against an inhuman and overwhelming enemy, stayed online longer. The system knew how to dose in just the right way for years, below the threshold of human perception, to gradually more and more radicalizing content to hook them into consuming more and more of it. So, white supremacists only had to be in the right place at the right time, with just the right amount of pompous and emotionally appealing content to get a free ride to the peak of their popularity. And, well, that unfortunately 2022 was not the peak. Now going to 2024, and I must say 25, it seems like far right Nazis going to the moon. And maybe Mars. And of course, others soon wanted to do the same, which led to the proliferation of blatantly over-categorizing irrelevant and fact-based content. In this way, systems that maximize screen time end up shaping the style in which the most popular publications are written next. So soon we will all be writing like Steve Bannon. As we look to the future, it would be more important than our political disagreements, at least initially, to see what kind of the role the computer and its machine learned, different from us, intelligence, have taken on as a steering mechanism of our social discourse. We still cannot see the forest for the trees. To distinguish between what the platform feeds us and how reality would actually appear if we looked at it face to face instead of through a recommendation algorithm, we still evaluate machine learning with human-based criteria, even though it would be important to start evaluating it from its own starting points. By developing our perspective, we could more easily see that the better we succeed in this game, the more we become its pawns. This fact has of course always affected those playing political and social value games since the beginning of humanity, but it has occurred within a framework whose end results are understandable to us. It was always clear in the end whose laps the power, fame, and glory fell into. But in the current situation, the nature of the players on the field has changed in a way that is unprecedented. Our age-old, human-driven games of power and influence have been wrapped up in a new meta-game layer of the social media platforms, and its rules and purposes are only loosely connected to the running of our communities. If we think about it from a game design perspective, we can take as example the development of puzzle games from Sudoku or crosswords into today's massive entertainment complexes, where fame and glory are collected like collectible card games, so that the original game itself is completely overshadowed by the metagame formed around it in terms of what the players value. The ever-changing collectible and cute video game characters and their equipment speak more than the game itself, which is just playing in the background. It is clear that the same thing is also threatening to happen to our own social power game under the pressure of the metagame of social media platforms. Just like in our modern mobile games, the tentacles of the metagame have become thicker than the game itself. And winning there is mandatory if you want to succeed in the basic game. Similarly, winning power in the game of modern society increasingly requires winning in the social media metagame as well. And although the media of the past also played their own metagames, they seem to fade into insignificance next to the metagame of modern social media platforms, and their connection to politics was obvious. The social media metagame operates on different terms than our own social game of conversation, and the power it wields is not easily visible. Its goals are also not apparent from the results of the game itself, because it is not strictly partisan, but operates above the game. However, it has the ability, the means, and the motivation to subtly shape the games we play in such a way that confrontation, alternative rules, conspiracy theories, moral disapproval, tribalism, and hate speech become to play an increasingly large role at the center of our game. The more shocking, the better.